Talking with famous people. Hi friends, host Eric here, host Talking with Famous People, and today we're discussing the supervisor relationship in Socionics. And this is at the suggestion of Rachel, who thought it would be an interesting topic, and I agree with her because it is in fact one of the things about Socionics that I am most behind is some of the intertype relationships. I think that they describe them really well, and in particular the supervisor relationship.
So how does one determine their supervisory relationship? Okay,
so if you aren't sure quite how to determine whether or not somebody is your supervisor or supervisee or whatever, you start with a given type, let's say your own type, and identify your first two functions. Let's say you're an INFP. Your first two functions are FI and NE. You take the second of those functions and you make that dominant. So NE dom and the first of those functions, and you make that one polar. So an NE dom with FI polar is going to be your supervisee. That's ENTP. And if you're going to do it the other way around, you would just say, well, what's my polar? For INFP, that's SE. So you know that it's going to be an SE dom with the INFP's dominant function as their tool. So SE dom with FI tool, which means ESFP is the supervisor of INFP.
Okay, so how would that look?
Well, it basically plays out like this. Your supervisor sees your basic frame of being, namely your dominant function, as just a way to do things. So, for example, Rachel's basic frame of being is NI, which means she goes through life in a universal knowledge frame. But for her supervisor, they're just going to see that as a tool to get things done, that universal knowledge frame. The blind spot is that supervisor type's basic way of being. So where you're always missing all the data, not picking up on it, not using an intentional manner appropriate to circumstances, your supervisor type will always be perfectly at home. This gives the supervisor type an insurmountable structural advantage over the supervisee, and both know it and behave accordingly, even if they've never heard of cognitive functions. I think that's an important thing to sort of drive home here, is that people who have no knowledge of supervisor relationships, cognitive functions, whatever, if you know where their two types are and you can know they're coming together to have a meeting, you can well anticipate that one of those two will defer to the other in an unusually consistent and clear way that may be totally inconsistent with how they normally behave around people of other types.
Can you give us an example of what that may visually look like?
Okay, so my doctor's an ISTP, and I went in to get prescribed Adderall from him. The first thing he said to me when I walked in and expressed what I was looking to do, get amphetamines prescribed, was there's no way he doesn't do that, he wasn't going to do that, and I'd have to go see a specialist. Now, I walked out of that meeting with an actual prescription. I would say that was probably inconsistent from the way he normally behaves. That normally he would have deliberated out ahead of time his position on this matter, as he did, express it to me, and then follow through on it. However, because I happen to be a supervisor type, he's vulnerable to my wiles, so to speak. One aspect of that relationship is that you automatically afford them respect beyond that which you would normally afford a normal, sort of a neutral other person, and you just sort of can't help it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I actually worked in an environment where I worked with an ESFJ and an ENTJ, and you can absolutely see who answered in the hierarchy of our company. The ESFJ was very accommodating to me, and I was very accommodating to the ENTJ. I wanted to...
And probably the ENTJ was nevertheless never impressed, right?
He didn't even remember my name.
Nevertheless never impressed is a good slogan for the supervisor-supervisee relationship.
Yeah.
I have done plenty of typings with INFPs, It doesn't matter how well I bada bing, bada boom the typing. Nevertheless, never impressed at the end of it. And they never really give me any feedback particularly on it, but I can tell they may not be like abjectly unimpressed, but they certainly aren't impressed, right? Mm-hmm. So that's part of that relationship as well.
That's how it can play out.
Shall we go down to the next page of this?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so let's go over who supervises whom.
The first group, we've got ENTP supervising ISTP, ISTP supervising ESFP, ESFP supervising INFP, and INFP supervising ENTP. So it kind of goes around in a circle. It gets back to the beginning there. Group 2 of the deliberation action types is alpha over delta. INTP supervises ENFP, ENFP over ISFP, ISFP over ESTP, ESTP over INTP. And then in the first knowledge interface group, you have ESFJ supervising ISTJ, ISTJ supervising ENTJ, ENTJ supervising INFJ, INFJ supervising ESFJ. And in the last group, you've got ISFJ over ENFJ, ENFJ over INTJ, INTJ over ESTJ, and ESTJ over ISFJ.
It's a good visual, I think, to have too, and I think it's a good idea to remember, like, that it goes circular.
Another way that supervisorial relationships plays out, I experienced with a former girlfriend's son who was an ISTP, and initially when I came into his home, he brought this sort of very action-based man thing, but in very short order, he simply ceased to battle me at all. He seemed to get the sense right away that he was not equipped to engage with me in any kind of back and forth about this. In fact, one time he was bitching about me to his mother, and she said, "Well, why don't you tell him that?" And he said, "Do you think I have any chance of beating him about this point?" Which is very much a supervisee kind of experience. Some interesting observations we made. Alpha never supervises Gamma, because, of course, they don't share any functions with Gamma. Beta never supervises Delta. What I would point out here basically is that it means that Alpha and Gamma are as far apart from each other as two quaders can be, and Beta and Delta are as far apart from each other as two quaders can be, which means that Alpha is somewhat more like Delta than Beta is like Delta, and Beta is somewhat more like Gamma than Alpha is like Gamma.
Yeah, I would call them friendly.
So you think that Alpha and Gamma are friendly?
Friendly, but beyond that, confusing.
I do think that the reason behind that sort of conclusion there is because there's nothing about that people from that type that seem immediately threatening to you. Mm-hmm. They're not attending on along the channels that you are inherently, and as a consequence, you sort of don't feel as though they're trotting on your ground at all.
Right.
There's no inherent bias either way going in.
Right.
They're like honest strangers.
Yeah, and it's like low expectation too. Sometimes maybe miscommunication, but overall I'd say it's friendly, or cordial between the two.
These things seem to break into two pairs. Alpha and Beta are basically paired together, and Gamma and Delta are basically paired together as being more like each other than they are like the others.
Yeah.
So, okay. The other observation about Alpha and Beta is that they have complete knowing in action, which is to say SI, NE, NI, and SI. SI, NI, the two knowing functions, and SE and NE, the two action functions, but they have incomplete deliberation interface, namely only the communicative half of it. That is to say, TI and FE. Whereas Gamma and Delta also have complete knowing in action. They've got both kinds of NE, SE, and NI, SI, but they too have just half of the interface deliberation. It's just the experiential half, FITE instead of TI, FE. Yeah.
I worked with an ENTJ at at a summer camp, and it didn't matter how much work I did or how much I volunteered and showed up. The ENTJ, my supervisor, did not know my name. He didn't know how I got there, and frankly, he was pretty stunned that I was even there at all.
And probably assumed you must not be contributing anything of value.
Yes, no.
That tends to be a bit of the feeling there.
Yeah.
All right, well, so that sums up the relationship. It is what it is.
It is what it is.
As I said before, if it doesn't matter if people know about cognitive functions, if you know their type, you can predictably see these in action. You can predict them, and you'll see it is in fact the case if you type the people right.
Yeah, and I want to say that maturity and time, place, how old you are,
it does play a role.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you get a little kid ENTP and an adult ISTP, it's unlikely the little kid is going to supervise the adult. If anything, the adult's probably going to just sort of not be around that little kid and find them annoying and presumptuous in some regard.
Right, exactly. You know, what kind of relationship you're having too, because I have read also that it's not bad having your supervisor as your boss if it's for a limited amount of time. Because,
better than the other way around, probably.
Yeah.
Well, they will provide you probably generally good guidance. Whether or not you'll be able to really understand or follow it is another question. In some sense, you'll always feel as though you're falling short. Your supervisor is to sort of things that you're all about as stuff that's not very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. We covered a lot of questions that I have been musing about over the past couple days, and it makes even more sense now that we worked on this.
All right, thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.
Plenty of cheese.
Talking with famous people.